Hello, you're listening to Future Artefacts FM, a radio show hosted by Niamh Schmidtke and Nina Davies.
Earlier this year, several radio frequencies were discovered airing a collection of broadcasts. At first, they sounded like regular news stories and interviews. They felt familiar, but also not quite belonging to our present. Slowly, the listeners came to believe that what they were listening to did indeed belong to their world, just not their time. They were looking into the future through the mundane edges of radio recordings and public service announcements. While this material is still being meticulously studied by researchers in various universities and museums, your hosts have managed to gain access to this collection to air a selection of these broadcasts for you, our listeners.
For full disclosure, we will not be sharing this collection with you, as this introduction is based on a fictional event. In this monthly broadcast, Future Artefacts FM, we will present speculative fiction pieces by artists and writers, followed by conversation with hosts Niamh Schmidtke and Nina Davies. The programme will focus on fictional works intended for broadcast, such as radio plays or fictional interviews, to carve out a better understanding of the now by exploring various interpretations of the future.
Welcome back to Future Artefacts. As per usual, I'm your host, Nina Davies.
And Niamh Schmidtke. And we're very excited today to have our first guest from an open call.
Yeah.
Yuli Serfaty, 1992, Israel, is a London-based multimedia artist researching natural landscapes in relation to local and global politics. Serfaty uses speculative fiction methodologies in order to world-build installations in textual, sonic, digital, and physical forms. Serfaty's approach is an open-ended ecology in which each element exists in relation, more than human webs, where landscapes are protagonists, making space for alternative power structures in which the marginalised, the unimportant, and the overlooked take central stage. Serfaty exhibited both nationally and internationally with selected exhibitions including Cosmosis, Shara High, London 2022, London Grads Now 21, Saatchi Gallery, London, Spazio, Volta, Art Verona 16 in Verona in 2021, Seam, Strata, Seance, Collective Ending in London 2021, and his featured work at Documentary, Who Speaks for a Space, London Short Film Festival 2021. In the same year, Serfaty had a solo show at Arad Contemporary Art Centre after being an artist-in-residence for 2 consecutive years. Serfaty has been the June 2021 artist-in-residence at Gazzelli Art House, London, and they are a recipient of the 2021 Sarabande Emerging Artist Award, as well as the 2021 Slade Prize. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Today we're going to be listening to Yuli's work called Picnic Zone, which is a 15-minute work, which Yuli is sort of a work in progress, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of finished as a sound work, but it's part of a larger...
Yeah, so it's in the midst of a cyclical process so it's part of a physical installation, so the installation is feeding the sound work is feeding the installation. I feel that this version of the work is pretty much done, but there might be further iterations in the future of this piece.
Great. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the listeners before we head into the work?
Yes, so the experience is made for headphones, so if you have headphones, please pop them on.
Great. So we're going to listen to the work now, and we'll see you on the other side.
Yeah, back in 15.
Bye.
You are entering a more than human space. There are buried relics of surveillance technologies and Israeli military architecture. mutating with transplanted pine trees, hyenas, whales. Archaeology in inverted commas. From erased peoples and times, shells and geomorphology of the Judean desert. This landscape has exposed its consciousness. You experience fragments of an entity minding its own business. Usually it ignores you. You are insignificant and powerless to affect it. On occasion, it becomes intrigued and acknowledges your presence by surveilling you. Intense mutation is happening across time and space. Mammals collide with combat drones and watchtowers. Death masks born 9,000 years ago make their bodies out of clay, and chaos manifests in trees and paws. I'm in the desert. I mean, I'm old. You are with me, you are. You step on dry soil and you look up because you thought you heard something. Is there a beep? There was a rush. There was a crowd. There's a room. It's my room. Don't look, it's mine. I made it. I'm the one doing the looking here. Shut up, I said. Don't look. You can't look. You can't see. You can't reach. It's not yours. Something's different. It's not wrong. I can't remember how it was. It's not that now. Something touched, now it's blended, and I am watching you. on the ground and I feel you walking. I am expansive and deep as the fossils, and someone made me to rule you, but they are gone, and I'm left behind. Oh. I'm left in front. Soil. I don't need them. I have my room and I'll bury myself in it with all the histories and stories and people who lived here, and instead there are poisonous trees and wet ground and buried houses with signs saying picnic zone.
Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed listening to the work. Just for reference, that was Yuli Serfaty's Picnic Zone. So, Yuli, we're introduced to this world through your voice, a world without humans, but with the traces of their infrastructures. What interests you in making a world without humans? And what happened to make them disappear?
I think the act of making humanity disappear from that landscape isn't so much about the disappearance, but I think what I'm interested in removing humanity is what happens when we're gone, when they're gone. So what gets our attention when what usually gets our attention is out of the way. So for me, it's a practice in noticing different things and not necessarily humanity or human acts or people or their histories.
I feel like there's also quite a human kind of desire to know if there isn't some kind of person in the story that like what happened, or perhaps what led to that point at which they were not existent, or kind of like if it's kind of part of our world but separate from it, like where does that borderline between where the humans have and don't have access?
I think this is exactly the point I'm interested in. So the point where you no longer have access, you as the listener, you as the viewer, or you as the person in the story. I feel that in Western society, we're very kind of locked into our own narrative of the world, of culture, of what is culture and what is nature, what is savage, what is humanity, essentially. And by limiting access of humanity to the work, it's an exercise for you to exist as a human in a space that doesn't care about humans, doesn't care about you, doesn't rate your culture or your history, or doesn't even take you into account.
Yeah.
I sort of feel like that every time that I go into any sort of like nature reserve where there aren't humans, that you do get kind of reminded about how small and insignificant you are. And I guess that's something that I find really interesting with your work, is that feeling of being watched or surveilled. That's quite an unnatural feeling. That is what separates your sort of forest or zone from something that we actually are quite familiar with. Is I always feel like I'm not being watched, or if I do, it's because I've just watched a horror film the night before and I'm worried that, like, I'm paranoid that I'm being watched. Yeah, and I think this mixing of, or this sort of mutation of surveillance technology sort of with, or just, I mean, in general, just technology, this mutation of technology and nature, I'm really interested in how you even came up with it. Like, what, like, sort of, where did you, I guess, in sort of this sense of world building, like, did you kind of imagine that there's some sort of like catalyzing moment where they start to mutate and how they start to mutate?
It's surprisingly, it's just there. So I've been working with the Israeli desert for a really long time, and I think I've done, this is the third kind of big project. I'm like the third body of work that I'm making. So there was a film and an interactive work and 2 installations, and it's been a really long process, a lot of writing and a lot of research. And I've been looking into the political context, the histories, the kind of complicated histories of different regimes that controlled the area over centuries. And it is very apparent when you are there. It's like you see places like Sodom or the Dead Sea or the columns of David, and really kind of biblical presences, and it all feels so divine and beautiful and spiritual. And then you turn around and there's a huge kind of industrial park with lots of waste and fumes, and like suddenly it smells horrible. And then a military, like an F-35, would fly overhead, and you hear like a really intense boom. And then at night you'd see little red dots flying around the skies, and these are military drones just flying around as you're on holiday near the Dead Sea. It's just a super surreal experience.
They become part of it, becomes part of the landscape.
Yeah.
So, in the same way that with the drones, I've got like a pretty clear image of like sort of seeing the stars and these little like...
Yeah, so you see the stars, and then there's one red star, and it whooshes back and forth above your head. So in that sense, I don't really feel like I made anything up. I did estrange it from that reality further to kind of make the point, but it is that landscape, and I find it extremely bizarre. And it's mainly very bizarre because I think before leaving Israel, I didn't realize how weird it was, and then after leaving and then coming back,
right,
it really kind of, it left a very deep effect on me.
And are you sort of, when you're there, are you aware that a lot of this is sort of military surveillance technology, or? Yeah,
they also tell you.
Right.
They tell you, like, beware, minefield, fire zone. There's signs everywhere, so you don't end up walking into a fire zone, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
Lots of fences and kind of and surveillance technology. So, for example, I was taking some drone footage for this work in the forest where this work takes place. And there are certain areas where the military blocks your signal, so you can't fly anything.
Right.
And the drone just comes back to you in the best of cases. In the worst cases, they take
just falls.
it.
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of thinking back to like the title of the work and how you're saying that there's these different zones which are marked off as in like, be careful, this area is not safe or something. And picnic zone kind of implying that it's a safe space. You know, you can sit here for a while. You're going to be, there's not a minefield around you. You're likely not going to be kind of watched as though you're an alien, kind of in the sense of like someone who's going to cause damage to that country or so on. Is that idea of picnic zone something that kind of, were you thinking about it in this way as sort of like playing with this idea of like quote unquote safe space, or where does picnic zone come from?
Yeah, I think it does play with the notion of a safe space, and the military signs, it depends who the target audience is, because they are either saying prohibited, you're going to be assaulted if you trespass, or they're saying stay out, this isn't safe for you. Normally it's the first type of warning, not the second. And the name picnic zone kind of comes from fire zone. So I think maybe this is a good point in the show to introduce the landscape, the specific landscape in which this work takes place. So this work takes place in the Yetir Forest, which is kind of on the northern edge of the Israeli desert. So it physically forms the border with the West Bank, between Israel and the West Bank. So it has a very heavy military presence, and it is being surveilled at all times. Officially, the forest was planted in the 60s to stop desertification, because the desert kind of moves around a lot as the climate changes. And this isn't, I mean, it's to do with climate change, definitely, but the desert threshold globally moves. It's not something that's static.
Yeah.
Right.
But it leaves the communities who live around that threshold in devastation, because suddenly if you were a farmer and then the desert grew in a radius of 20 kilometers throughout the threshold, then that is devastating for you. So Israel, there's a lot of really bad things about us, but we are really good with ecological kind of innovation technologies, and we plant a lot, for better or worse, as you'll learn in the following couple of minutes. So the government planted this forest in order to stop the desert from growing. So essentially it was supposed to be a green belt. This is the official reason. Practically, there are loads of unrecognized Bedouin villages around all of the desert, but particularly that north side. They're unrecognized for very kind of convoluted reasons, some to do with the British mandate and a lot to do with current kind of Israeli policies. And the forest has been planted. Essentially, the villages are being demolished, and then the forests are planted overnight. And then the shepherds and the farmers can't come back because there are trees, and also because they can't work the land anymore. And there are laws prohibiting cutting down trees. So essentially, they are being deported from their lands using planting and trees. So that is one side of it. And then the other side of this particular forest, it's a pine monoculture. So the needles fall to the ground and they're very acidic. So they acidify the soil and essentially kill off everything else that grows in the area. So the local ecosystem has been destroyed in that local
landscape.
Yeah, in that local landscape. Thank you. And on top of everything, the desert water system works in a way that water falls in the tops of the mountain. So this is close to the Hebron mountain, so it's quite high up, and flows down and floods into the valleys. But because now there's a forest there, the soil is much softer and it absorbs a lot more of the water, so it actually makes the inner desert drier. So somehow they managed to make a forest that is the complete opposite of what we think of as forests.
Right, yeah.
And yet when you're actually there, the experience is the forest floor is dead. Nothing grows. It's just trees and kind of grey needles. And then quite often you'd see military vehicles and soldiers on patrol and watchtowers and there's a lot of kind of military architecture around. And then there would be picnic tables, and you're kind of it's marketed as like a leisure destination, and I don't understand. Yeah, why would anyone want to have a picnic in that space? And yet people do.
Yeah.
So this is where the name of the work comes from. That kind of weird feeling that all of these convoluting things are happening in one space, and it all comes down to a picnic bench.
Because I guess I have a question that's kind of about this forest and sort of how that location affects the world which you build, because of course in using speculation you're using a very real place and kind of very real experiences, but then making them more fantastical in a way through the sense of humans are no longer part of that space but their infrastructures are. How do you feel this specific location has affected the kind of, I guess maybe like the narrative in a way that is like throughout the piece, like the voice we hear throughout the work, or even just you're saying this is part of a larger series? I guess that thread between environment and maybe story and character.
Yetir Forest dictates the kind of contrasting elements that are guiding me throughout all the pieces in the work. So elements of control, elements of surveillance, elements of biology, of ecology, of relations between different elements in one space. So it's really the guide and the kind of home, maybe the vessel that all the characters live in.
Mm-hmm.
So everything I make within this body of work takes place according to this inherent contradiction of the space.
I'm trying to imagine how much more dystopic your audio work is compared to the reality of being in the space.
I actually think it's quite realistic. I mean, this is my personal reading of the space. A lot of people would see it differently. Some Israeli people would be offended, and I get it. It's their home. But for me, it's quite realistic. And I love that in the preparation text you sent me, you called it a present dystopia, which I think is very accurate.
In that sort of question, I was wondering whether, because there is sort of something with your work, I don't want to call it a utopia because I don't think it is a utopia, but there's something quite peaceful going on with sort of current narratives about climate change, where it seems like, I mean, it's so obvious that, like humans are not the best thing for the earth, basically. This zone that doesn't have humans in it is sort of post-human. It seems to me post-human, where sort of technology is still sort of functioning on its own, or now not functioning in collaboration with humans. It's functioning in collaboration with other forms of being. And there seems to be something, I don't know, maybe something sort of not positive, but there seems to be something sort of like optimistic about it. And I was wondering whether that was my own interpretation of it, or whether there is any form of optimism in this zone for you.
I don't know whether to call it optimism. It's funny that it's interesting that you mention climate change, because I also feel like our narrative about climate change is like, oh, it's going to be the end of the world. No, it's just going to be the end of humanity. The world is going to keep going in any form it can, with or without us. It's just a shame that we're kind of destroying our own chances to take part in it. And that's again a kind of exercise in attention and a practice of how much space we take in our narrative of the world. That is my view of it in any case. And regarding this work, I'm not very interested in giving kind of binary answers about this. I'm really enjoying it's kind of like what you said about the feeling you get when you're in nature. It's just there, and it's up to you to make of it what you make of it. Reading this really beautiful book called Experiments in Imagining Otherwise by Lola Olufemi, and it's like I'm still in the middle of it, and I feel like my view of the world is changing as I read it. And they really practice radical hope against all odds, against reality, against everything. A hope that is painful and hard and seem redundant. A hope in face of destruction, a hope in face of dystopia.
But I feel like there's also something else in what you're saying about also not giving these binary answers, and even in the work that you've kind of presented today as well, where this is projecting one version, one world, in like a multitude of others. And even how going to Yetir Forest, kind of when you're entering from your perspective in your world, you see it as being this very dystopic place, because it's kind of sit here, have a picnic while the military drones circle you. Other people who have only ever experienced that kind of world would say, oh, isn't this lovely? We're in a forest, we're having a picnic. And it's that kind of idea of those two worlds almost colliding with one another. And I guess for me, when I haven't read the book, but I've kind of seen a lot around that kind of idea of radical hope. And for me, a lot of that also builds into that narrative of you're not going to like, quote unquote, save any world, but some worlds are going to thrive, some worlds are going to end, and some worlds are going to begin.
Yeah.
And this idea of kind of just figuring out which ones of those worlds do you want to be within or a part of or create or tear down in a way.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just as ambiguous as before, but
I think that ambiguity is exactly what I'm trying to achieve, because as you say, it's just one story out of many, and it really feels, especially like in the world we exist in today, there is no one truth, and it is what we make of it, and that making of it is difficult and challenging and needs to be really active. So I don't want to give anyone any answers for them, because they need to make it for themselves. Having said all of this, and this is my internal effort to maintain ambiguity in this work, so I'm criticizing the Israeli government quite heavily in my life and in my practice. But the speaker in the work is the concept of Golem, which I don't know if the listeners will be familiar with, so I'll introduce it a little bit. Essentially, a golem is a Jewish mythological being, creature, not exactly a creature. Sometime in the 1600s, there was a rabbi that was trying to protect his community from pogroms and anti-Semitism. So he fashioned out of clay and soil a humanoid figure and brought it to life. And that figure was the protector of the Jewish community. And throughout the years, there have been male golems, female golems, non-binary golems, and they were bringers of peace, of war. They were protecting, they were messengers, it's a very mutable metaphor. And essentially the character of Golem is that trope of a scientist will make a creation, the creation takes on life, gains consciousness, and overthrows the scientist. So Frankenstein, even Golem from Lord of the Rings. So in this work, I use the landscape as kind of my golem, and the landscape comes to life and gains consciousness to protect whatever it is it chose to protect. And it takes over the narration voice and overthrows the narrator from kind of the beginning of the piece to its end.
Yeah.
So in using Golem, I'm kind of radically still adopting my Jewish identity, even though I am criticizing the Israeli government.
Because those two things can exist
separately. Or the existence of the first doesn't determine the form of existence of the other.
Yeah.
So it's really important to me to hold these two things and their complexities together.
Yeah, because I guess that was something I was thinking about as you were speaking, and even as kind of you were talking as well about this idea of radical hope, or not providing like a binary response or answer about the work for you, and like making this piece or kind of having it as part of this larger installation and series, which I'm sure still has many ends, which you're kind of figuring out where they're going. Is there a critical aim specifically in looking at this forest in this space and this kind of mutation that you want to draw our attention to right now? Like, do you feel that there is some kind of maybe message or guideline or warning within the work? For me, listening to the piece, it's incredibly atmospheric, and then in hearing the voice, it does feel like there is some kind of warning which I'm supposed to be heeding to, but I'm not entirely sure where exactly my mind's going to and thinking through what that warning is trying to give.
I think there isn't a definitive warning in the work. It is definitely very important to me to tell the story of the forest and to tell the story of the displacement that is happening and of the militarization of the landscape and of the violence that is taking place. I guess the warning is, if you don't practice radical hope, then this is already your reality, not only in Israel, but in many places across the world. The criticism is definitely there. The warning is maybe yours to make out.
Yeah, because I guess we listen to a lot of very dystopic audio pieces on this show, and I feel like there's often a sense of picking out messages or warnings or truths. I say it in like quite a vague way, like truths to the artist or truths to the listener at the point of listening. But I guess I'm kind of thinking about, because I feel especially with your work, because it's leaning much more so into speculation as opposed to into fantasy. And for me, there's a large sense in speculation of it's kind of presenting an alternate present or future or even past in a way that's sort of almost enlightening you of the present in a way. And I guess what I'm trying to kind of figure out or like tease out from you as well is that what that kind of knowledge is in a way, like when we have all of these complexities in terms of a political, a militaristic, a geographic and a cultural history in this big melting pot. What are you trying to bring out from us in that, aside from maybe trying to remove some of these binaries in terms of how these coexist with one another?
I think it's exactly that. I think I want you to hold that complexity. And I think I have to see the world as a complex place. I can't bring myself to see anything as a standalone element. And I think I want the experience of my work in general to be able to hold complexity and to be able to hold horror and beauty and social wrongs and poetics in one.
Yeah, because I know when we were talking about this work before recording and we were asking you about different references, one thing you really recommended to us was Annihilation. The book, not the film.
The book, not the film, definitely.
And I took a day to like listen to Annihilation on background while doing a bunch of other tasks, and had this very creepy kind of like feeling like sort of just behind my back. And when listening to this work again after that, I could really feel that sense. I guess that kind of like slow creep in a way, or maybe like a slightly occult sense. Is that something that you feel like you've explored in your work previously, or is it more so something that you're trying to kind of tease out or kind of like play with the genre a bit more now?
I think it's both. I think I've experimented with this before slightly, and then I read Annihilation, and I think the book does this in a really beautiful way, and that really inspired me to push further and use more, because I've used speculation before, but this time I'm very practically developing characters, and I'm developing the relationship between one and the other, and their relationship to the landscape and where they live and what they're like and what their character traits are and how they may or may not treat you as the viewer. And what I find really beautiful in the book is that we don't even know the names of the human characters. We don't know their backgrounds. We don't know almost anything about them. All we know is the landscape and the way it mutates. And I really love that shift in attention. So I've directly adopted that in this work, definitely.
Well, at the beginning of Annihilation, I noticed how they said that they don't bring, they're not allowed to bring any technical devices in with them. And I sort of am making my own inferences into whether the reason why they're not is that this sort of mutation can kind of mutate any sort of information or like any kind of knowledge. And at the beginning of the story, the sort of natural formations that look like language are starting. So they've even sort of mutated into just language as language on its own. But and it did make me think when I just listened to that one part, I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's a narrative that they don't really like go down, but they kind of almost like hint to it at the beginning of the story of like you can tell that there's kind of a bit of a backstory there to Annihilation, that maybe they have at some point brought in technologies and they've decided not to, because it's as soon as these mutations start using technology, it's game over. Like that is sort of like, as humans, that's how we function now in today's world. And then to even see that sort of danger of it starting to pick up language and the main character going in to read. And yeah, anyways, I won't spoil anything. But I think that that's what I enjoyed about it. Nods to that. And then I felt like in your work, you are kind of telling another version of, I mean, your research is different, but you're sort of telling another version of that sort of story. Of course, it's about what sort of, actually maybe this is a question, what sort of do you feel like is mutating in your world? Because it feels like the forest itself is still sort of in my imagination when I'm listening to your work, the forest is still very much like a traditional forest, and the things that are mutating are actually the technologies to the natural.
So the forest currently, well, it's a desert really. The forest is already a mutation with the desert. So in that sense, I feel like the forest has already mutated. Currently in the work, yes, the forest is pretty much unchanged. The mutations that are happening, so we've spoken about Golem, the mythology of the Golem is kind of mutating with the narrator, let's call it.
Yeah.
Mutating with the narrator, mutating with the landscape. So it kind of says like, I am the mountain, I am the forest, I am the soil. So it's mutating with the land itself. So that's the Golem characters. That's the Golem character, sorry. And then there's two other characters at the moment, and their mutations are much more straightforward, much more formal rather than conceptual. So one of the characters is called Drone, and he is a combat drone that was mutated with whales. So the whole area, like, I don't know how many millions of years ago, was covered by a sea called Thetis. And now it's kind of retracted and has left a couple of lakes along the way. So the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and now the Red Sea, kind of where it meets the oceans. And there are still there are whales in the Red Sea still.
Oh,
not
really?
Okay. Not in one of the lakes. They're tiny. And obviously nothing lives in the Dead Sea. So nothing.
That's what I was going to. Yeah, I was going to say. No. I didn't think anything could live in the Dead Sea.
But there are whales in the Red Sea. So the combat drone has mutated with a whale, and he's quite snobbish. So he's like, he loves himself a lot. So he had his portrait taken. So he's kind of presenting himself, and he's very kind of pompous, and would maybe like, he's very curious, and he might approach you to kind of check you out or kind of judge you a little bit. But he'd also get bored quite easily, so he'd drift away and kind of mind his own business for a while. He's also a creative entity, so he is presenting his own video works, which are the actual drone footage that I took in the forest. And the other character that I'm working on right now is Watchtower, and she is way more kind of mysterious, so her tendency is to kind of hide. So she's mutated with a hyena, so there are striped hyenas in the desert. And what I love about hyenas is their ability to, the females would grow their clitoris really large, so it looks like a penis. So they are...
This is in real life.
This is in real life. Yeah. They are mutating themselves to look like males to protect themselves and to essentially make sure no one kind of messes with them. So I really love this about hyenas. And in this work, hyena has merged with a watchtower. And the watchtower takes form of... this is very much still in progress, so I'm not sure if it will take form of more of an actual watchtower or more of like a hunting tent. But in any case, it would be surveilling its environment around it and would be camouflaged with kind of hyena tropes. And it would hide things within it. So you kind of can see that there are objects there, but you can't necessarily see them, or can't necessarily see them well, you can't see them at all times. And then the relationships between them, and we don't know much about Watchtower's personality because she's very like mysterious and she doesn't share a lot. Watchtower and Drone are not the best of friends. They're kind of like, they have a bit of beef. Golem takes a lot of kind of emotional support from Watchtower. And Drone is a little bit like an older brother to Golem, but the relationship between Drone and Watchtower isn't very clear at the moment. Like, we don't know why they're having beef. Yeah.
And just to clarify for the listeners, the sound work that we've listened to as a part of this, the Golem character is mostly kind of featured
in would be
this
Sonic,
work.
Yeah. Golem character. The Golem character is Sonic.
In this sort of mutation between these surveillance technologies and the natural world, I was wondering whether there's a sort of hierarchy. When we think of surveillance technologies, we think of like they act as a medium and they kind of communicate. This is something that they're always communicating to. They're sort of this end. They don't really completely act autonomously. I'm sure they probably do in some ways today. And I was wondering if the surveillance technologies are sort of providing information to the natural landscape, or whether there's one that kind of communicates to the other. If there's one that desires the information more, or
I think it's more of a rhizome of connections. So if anything, maybe these radio transmissions are just floating in air and will endlessly transmit to nowhere and no one. I think I like the sense of kind of how futile it is to try and manage or control a landscape or nature or even peoples or cultures in certain ways. It sounds quite ridiculous when we're just going to take this landscape and now we're going to control each and every element of it.
Yeah.
It just sounds
But is that sort of
pointless.
That sort of is what's happening?
Yeah, exactly. It is what's happening. So I think I'm extenuating that pointlessness of that pointless circulation of information. Golem is saying in the text as well, like, they put me here to rule you, but they're gone and I'm just like here and I'm not really sure what to do about that now.
Yeah, because I kind of read that bit that Golem is saying almost as though they're going a little bit mad.
Yeah.
As well. It's kind of like, I am this, I am that. I'm not really sure what's my, like, why am I here? What's the point of it?
Yeah.
It's like, what place are we in a way? And almost in my mind, I was thinking back to Annihilation and how there's this section in it where there's a psychiatrist that puts the rest of the members under some form of kind of trance in order to calm them into entering this world which is not a home for them, and thinking about what happens if this golem has been under some kind of trance that they've just woken up from, or what happens if they're just kind of entering in and out of that space, or like how that madness arises in a way.
Thinking about the soldiers in the space, which is kind of the role Golem is taking, the watchman, the guardian, the kind of person in charge. But these soldiers are often children, they're 18 years old, and they're just being put in that landscape to guard the border of their country, or to have the responsibility to shoot if they need to have the physical power to assert domination over a whole population of another people. And from my experience in the military, was very mild, but my friends who were, like, some of them were combat soldiers, you very much feel like you were put at the end of the world, and you really don't really understand the point, but you kind of have to do it because otherwise they'll, like, put you in military jail, or
right,
and you don't really stop to question it. So I guess this is like a moment of sobriety where you understand that you've just been put here and there's no real reason for it and you don't really understand what you're doing.
Okay. And then trying to almost navigate amongst your environment.
Yeah, and then to navigate this situation you found yourself in, and you kind of have to stick out, or to get out of that situation requires really radical actions.
And it's kind of making me think about, because none of these characters, I mean, maybe Golem in a way as they kind of mutate with their environment, but they're not static beings. Do you ever envisage how they might exist if they left the forest, for example? Or is this very much their home? Because I guess
it is them. It is physically them. So they are physically the soil and the kind of layers of I refer to archaeology in inverted commas in the text. That is, a lot of the kind of ruins of villages are not actually that old, and they're labeled as archaeology to kind of make it look like, people haven't lived here for centuries, but actually it's like 100 years old and it was totally someone's home, like not that long ago.
Yeah.
And at the other side of that, if you'd find the slightest hint of a Jewish archaeological site, then the entire area would be vacated for that excavation and would be kind of declared Jewish. Or some Palestinian villages would have Muslim presence, or they'll have the kind of entire evidence of Palestinian life, and then there will be a church, so the entire village will be demolished other than the church. So there's this whole kind of politics around archaeology, and there's just layers and layers and layers of lives and homes and structures in that area, but generally in Israel, that I find really interesting.
Does this sort of also relate to these Bedouin communities that are sort of, I want to say being evicted, but they're not even really being evicted.
It's being demolished.
Demolished, yeah. Is that, how are those sites Because I remember you saying once when we were speaking before that these Bedouin villages and communities aren't even labelled on. They're not even labelled on maps.
They're not labelled on maps. No.
So once they're demolished, like, are they even? I guess they're not considered ruins.
That's
either.
the problem.
Yeah.
That there's a problem of history. So people like forensic architecture are doing really, really important work in kind of proving that these villages did exist and have been existing for such and such amount of time, because the kind of I want to be careful of like telling other people's kind of
course,
stories, but just as a kind of practical, the Bedouin have been considered like a nomadic people, but they haven't really been nomadic for over 100 years now. So the government is kind of using that notion of them being nomadic to say like, oh, what do you care if you live here or over there? Just go over there.
That's just how you that's how you exist.
Because you're nomadic anyway.
Yeah.
And then they say, my great-great-great-grandfather is buried here. Here's the grave. What are you talking about? So yeah, for further information, forensic architecture, definitely, if you want to learn more.
For a more in-depth understanding of kind of the different meanings of which archaeology takes on in an Israeli political stance.
And especially
the
kind of the Bedouin situation and how the government treats them. Like if you've seen the Turner Prize exhibition a couple of years ago, they break down one of the instances that happened to one Bedouin family.
On that note, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. Is there anything else you would like to share about this work or you feel is important for listeners to know that we haven't touched on?
I don't know if there's anything else I'd like to share right now. I feel like the work as a whole is very much still developing. So I guess watch the space. But I do want to say that I'm co-curating a group show with Alia Hamawi in Collective Ending that's open right now. It's going to be open 23rd of September until the 23rd of October. We are open Thursday, Friday, Saturdays, or by appointment, so reach out if you want to see it. And it very much deals with questions of speculation, mutation, watery beginnings, and it features Madison Bycroft, Sophie May Birkin, and Leila Majid and Louis Newby. So yeah, please come through.
We're going to add Yuli's website at the bottom of the RTM site, and you can also find their Instagram handle as well, where you can find all the details pretty easily on our Instagram
and website.
Yes.
Which we now have. I can't remember if I've already made an announcement about that in the previous episode.
Oh yeah, Future Artefacts FM does indeed have a website.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a
it
pleasure.
Really, really interesting work. Like really, really great. It was I think this is going to be a good episode.
Thanks so much.
So it's been really great to find out more about your work through this process and share it with our listeners as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great.
All right. Bye.
Bye.